Sarah Holloway stood on the porch of her weathered ranch house, her black dress absorbing the heat like a curse. 6 months had passed since they'd buried her husband James beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill, and the ranch was dying along with her hopes. At 42, Sarah's face bore the map of hard years, lines carved by wind and worry, skin tanned to leather by the relentless sun. But her eyes remained sharp, calculating, the eyes of a survivor. She watched Joshua work in the corral, breaking a young mare with a patience that bordered on tenderness. Joshua was 28, tall and broad-shouldered, his skin the color of polished mahogany. James had bought him 8 years ago in New Orleans, paying a premium price for his size and strength. But it was Joshua's quiet intelligence that had made him invaluable to the ranch. He could read the weather, handle any animal, and fix anything that broke. In a territory where survival depended on such skills, Joshua was worth his weight in gold. Sarah's 3 daughters sat in the parlor behind her, pretending to work on their needlepoint while actually watching their mother with barely concealed anxiety. Martha was 23, with her mother's strong features and her father's stubborn jaw. Elizabeth, at 21, had inherited a delicate beauty that seemed almost cruel in this harsh land. And Rebecca, just 19, possessed a fierce intelligence that her mother had tried unsuccessfully to temper with feminine graces. The problem was simple and devastating. There were no suitable men for miles. The nearest town, San Felipe, was a 2-day ride away, and its male population consisted mostly of drifters, drunks, and men already married. The few ranchers in the territory had sons who were either too young, too old, or too poor to be considered prospects. And with each passing month, Sarah watched her daughter's youth slip away like sand through fingers. But there was a deeper problem, one that kept Sarah awake at night in her empty bed. Without heirs, the ranch would eventually pass to James's brother in Virginia, a man who had never set foot in Texas and who would sell the land without a second thought. Everything James and Sarah had built, the corrals, the house, the small herd they'd nursed through droughts and Indian raids, would be scattered to the winds. Sarah had spent 6 months wrestling with an idea that would have horrified her younger self, the genteel Virginia girl who'd married James Holloway and headed west with dreams of a grand plantation. But the wilderness had burned away her illusions, leaving only the hard core of pragmatism that separated survivors from corpses. She called her daughters to the porch. They came, still clutching their needlework, knowing from their mother's expression that something significant was about to occur. "Girls," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "we need to discuss the future of this ranch."
Martha, the eldest, spoke first. "Mother, we'd been thinking, perhaps we could hire more hands, expand the herd." "With what money?" Sarah cut her off. "And what hands? Every able-bodied man in Texas is either fighting Comanches, searching for silver, or farming their own land." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There is a solution, but it requires courage and a willingness to cast aside certain conventions." The 3 young women exchanged glances. Elizabeth's hand went to her throat in a nervous gesture she'd inherited from her grandmother. "Joshua," Sarah said simply. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Rebecca recovered first, her quick mind leaping ahead to the inevitable conclusion. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious," Sarah's voice was iron. "Joshua is healthy, strong, and intelligent. More importantly, he's here. Any children born to you would legally be free persons, because their mothers are free. They'll be your children, raised in this house, heirs to this land. And yes, they'll be mixed blood, but this is Texas, not Virginia. The rules are different here." "What does Joshua say?" Rebecca asked quietly. Sarah's expression hardened. "Joshua is property. He doesn't get a say." But that wasn't entirely true, and they all knew it. James had never been a cruel master, and Sarah had continued his relatively humane treatment. Joshua lived in his own cabin, ate the same food as the family, was rarely subjected to the whip. But he was still a slave, still bound to obey. "I won't do it," Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face. "I'd rather die." "Then you're a fool," Sarah snapped. "Death is exactly what awaits us if we do nothing. This ranch is our only protection against a world that has no place for women alone." Rebecca stepped forward, her young face suddenly old. "If we do this, Mother, we become monsters. We become exactly what we hate about this system." "We're already monsters," Sarah said quietly. "We've owned another human being for 8 years. At least this way some good might come of it."
That evening, Sarah walked down to Joshua's cabin as the sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. She carried a lantern, though there was still enough light to see by. The ritual of the lamp was a kind of formality, a way of marking the significance of the moment. Joshua sat on his porch, a piece of leather in his hands that he was working into a bridle. He stood when he saw her approaching, a lifetime of conditioning making the gesture automatic. "Sit, Joshua," Sarah said, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. She remained standing, needing the advantage of height for what came next. "I have a proposition for you," she began, and then proceeded to outline her plan with the same brutal efficiency she brought to every aspect of ranch management. Joshua listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral. But Sarah had lived alongside him for 8 years, and she could read the subtle signs of his reaction, the tightening around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands stilled on the leather. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Joshua spoke, his voice low and measured. "And if I refuse?" It was a question they both knew was meaningless. Sarah could simply order him to comply, could beat him if he resisted, could sell him to someone far crueler if he continued to refuse. But Sarah found herself answering honestly anyway. "Then we'll likely lose the ranch within 2 years. Your new owner might not be as reasonable as we've been." Joshua's laugh was bitter. "Reasonable? That's what you call this?" "No," Sarah admitted. "I call it survival. I call it pragmatism. I call it the only option I can see that doesn't end in total destruction." "For you," Joshua said. "Not for me." "For all of us," Sarah countered. "Any children born of this arrangement will be free. Your children, Joshua. Free children." Something flickered in Joshua's eyes. Pain, longing, anger, she couldn't tell. Free bastards. Mixed blood children in a world that will hate them for existing. "Perhaps," Sarah conceded, "or perhaps they'll be ranchers, landowners, people of substance in a territory too new to have fully established its hatreds." Joshua stood and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the darkening prairie. "And your daughters? What do they think of this plan?" "They're young. They'll come to understand necessity." "Will they?" Joshua turned to face her. "Or will they hate me for the rest of their days? Will they hate the children we create?" Sarah had no answer for that. It was a risk, a terrible gamble with human souls as the stakes. But what choice did they have? "I want something in return," Joshua said finally. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But if I'm to do this, if I'm to father your grandchildren and secure your legacy, then I want terms." Despite herself, Sarah felt a grudging respect. "Name them." "First, if children are born, they're to be raised as my children too. Not just your grandchildren, but my sons and daughters. I want to have a say in their upbringing." Sarah considered this. It was unprecedented, but then so was everything about this situation. Agreed, within reason. "Second, I want papers, freedom papers, drawn up legal and proper to take effect when the youngest child reaches their 10th birthday." This gave Sarah pause. Joshua free would be Joshua able to leave, taking his knowledge and skills with him. But 10 years was a long time, and perhaps by then they'd have established enough stability to manage without him. 15 years, she countered. 12. Done. Joshua nodded slowly. "And third, I want respect. From you, from your daughters, from everyone on this ranch. I won't be treated like a stud horse, brought out when needed and ignored otherwise." "You will have to earn that respect, Joshua, same as anyone." "Haven't I already?" There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet dignity that made Sarah look away. "Yes," she admitted, "you have." Martha was the first, because she was the eldest, and because her practical nature made her the most likely to accept the arrangement. Sarah sent her to Joshua's cabin on a cool evening in late September, when the first hints of autumn touched the air. Martha wore a simple dress and carried herself with rigid dignity, as if she were going to her execution rather than to conceive a child. Sarah watched from the porch until her daughter disappeared into Joshua's cabin, then turned away, unable to bear witness to the consequences of her decision. Inside the cabin, Martha and Joshua faced each other like duelists. The small space was clean and spare: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a trunk for Joshua's few possessions. A single candle provided light. "I don't want to do this," Martha said, her voice shaking. "I know," he replied. He made no move toward her, standing near the door as if to offer her an escape route. "But Mother says—"
"I know what your mother says," Joshua's voice was gentle, "but you're not your mother, Martha. You're a person, not a chess piece." Martha looked at him in surprise. It might have been the first time he'd addressed her by name, rather than Miss Martha. The informality of it was shocking in its intimacy. "If we don't do this, we'll lose everything," she said. "Is everything worth this price?" The question hung between them. Martha found herself really looking at Joshua for the first time in years, seeing beyond the slave, beyond the worker, to the man himself. He had kind eyes, she realized, patient eyes, and there was a sadness in them that matched her own. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I'm here now, and I don't think I can go back to that house and face Mother having failed." Joshua nodded slowly. "Then we'll do this, but not like animals in the dark. If we're to create life, Martha, let it be done with some measure of kindness." What happened between them that night remained forever private, known only to the 2 participants. But when Martha emerged 3 hours later, her face was streaked with tears, though whether of shame, relief, or something else entirely, Sarah couldn't tell. Elizabeth came next, 2 weeks later, and her experience was different. Where Martha had approached the situation with grim determination, Elizabeth was terrified. She shook so badly that Joshua finally made her sit down and drink some of the whiskey he kept hidden under his floorboards. "I can't do this," Elizabeth sobbed. "I can't. Joshua knelt beside her chair, not touching her, but present. "Then don't," he said simply. "Your mother will—" "Your mother isn't here. Right now, in this cabin, it's just you and me. And I won't force you, Elizabeth. Not for the ranch, not for freedom, not for anything." Elizabeth looked up at him through her tears. "You'd defy her? Risk punishment?" "I've risked worse," Joshua said quietly. "A man has to draw a line somewhere." In the end, Elizabeth stayed. But it took hours of gentle conversation, of Joshua sharing stories of his childhood in Louisiana, of Elizabeth slowly uncovering the humanity she'd been taught to ignore. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that surprised them both. Rebecca was the last, and the most complicated. Unlike her sisters, Rebecca had always treated Joshua with a kind of distant courtesy that acknowledged his intelligence. She'd taught him to read better, sharing her books with him, despite their mother's disapproval. And Joshua had shown her the practical knowledge that books couldn't teach: how to track animals, read the sky, survive in the wilderness. When she came to his cabin in late October, she brought a chessboard. One game, before.
They played by candlelight, and Joshua won, as he usually did. Rebecca studied the board, then looked up at him. "Do you hate us?" she asked quietly. Joshua considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but mostly I just hate the situation. Your mother's wrong about a lot of things, but she's right about one. We're all trapped here together." "Free people can leave," Rebecca pointed out. "Can they?" Joshua countered. "Where would you go? Back to Virginia, where they'd call you an old maid and marry you off to whoever would have you? Stay here and watch the ranch die? You're as trapped as I am, Rebecca, just in different chains." The truth of it stung, but Rebecca couldn't deny it. "Maybe the children will be freer than we are." "Maybe," Joshua agreed. "That's the hope anyway." By spring, all three daughters were pregnant. The changes came slowly at first: missed courses, morning sickness, the gradual swelling of bellies. Sarah watched with satisfaction tinged with guilt, seeing her plan come to fruition while knowing the cost. The daughters' reactions varied. Martha threw herself into preparation, sewing tiny clothes and rearranging her room to accommodate a cradle. Elizabeth moved through her days in a kind of dreamy detachment, as if pregnancy had happened to someone else. And Rebecca grew increasingly quiet, spending long hours reading on the porch or walking the ranch boundaries. Joshua continued his work, but something had fundamentally shifted. He no longer kept his eyes lowered when addressing the family, no longer accepted orders without question. It was subtle, but everyone felt it: the slow transformation from slave to something else, something undefined. The first sign of real trouble came in June when Tobias Walker rode onto the ranch. Walker was a neighboring rancher, a hard man who ran his land with an iron fist and his slaves with a whip. He'd called on Sarah several times over the past months, making it clear he'd be interested in buying the Holloway ranch if she decided to sell. Sarah received him on the porch, offering neither refreshment nor a seat. Behind her, Martha's pregnancy was beginning to show. Walker's eyes went to Martha's belly, then swept across to where Elizabeth and Rebecca sat, both now visibly pregnant. His expression shifted from curiosity to understanding to disgust in the space of a heartbeat. "My God," he breathed, "you've let that buck service them." Sarah's face remained impassive. "My daughter's conditions are no concern of yours, Mr. Walker." "The hell they aren't," Walker exploded. "You've contaminated your own bloodline, made mongrels of your grandchildren. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "People can say whatever they like," Sarah replied coldly. "Now get off my land."
But Walker wasn't finished. "You think this will save your ranch? You've damned it. No decent person will do business with you. No church will have you. And those things your daughters are carrying, they'll be pariahs, neither white nor black, accepted nowhere." "They'll be heirs," Sarah said. "That's all that matters." Walker spat on the porch boards. "You've made yourself into a whore mistress and your daughters into whores. I hope it was worth it." He rode off in a cloud of dust, and Sarah stood rigid, listening to her daughters crying behind her. She'd known there would be consequences, but the venom in Walker's voice shook her more than she wanted to admit. That night, she found Joshua working in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare. "Walker was here," she said, without preamble. I heard. Joshua didn't look up from his examination of the mare's legs. He'll spread the story. By next month, everyone in the territory will know what we've done. Does that surprise you? Sarah's laugh was harsh. No, I knew this would happen. I didn't expect it to hurt quite so much. Joshua finally looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was unreadable. What did you think would happen, Mrs. Holloway? That people would applaud your pragmatism? That they'd understand the impossible choice you made? I thought they might mind their own damn business, Sarah snapped. Then you're a fool. Joshua's voice was quiet but firm. You've broken one of the great taboos of this society. White women bearing black children. It terrifies them more than anything else because it threatens the entire structure they've built to keep people like me in chains. I know what I've done, Sarah said. Do you? Do you really understand what you've condemned those children to? What you've condemned your daughters to? I've given them a future. You've given them infamy. Joshua corrected. You've made them into parables, cautionary tales mothers will tell daughters. See what happens when you forget your place? See what happens when a woman tries to survive on her own? The truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank down onto a hay bale, suddenly exhausted. Then what should I have done? Let the ranch die? Watch my daughters end up as servants or prostitutes in San Felipe? Joshua was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. I don't know. Maybe there was no good choice. Maybe there was just bad and worse, and you chose the one you could live with. Can you live with it? With what I've made you do?
Joshua's laugh was bitter. I'm a slave, Mrs. Holloway. I don't get the luxury of choosing what I can live with. I just live, day by day, and try to find some meaning in the survival. The babies came in the winter, 3 in the span of 6 weeks. Martha delivered first, a boy with Joshua's strong features and her own fierce determination. She named him James, after her father, and dared anyone to object. Elizabeth's labor was harder, lasting through a night and most of a day. When her son finally emerged, tiny and perfect, she held him with a fierce protectiveness that surprised everyone. She called him Thomas, after no one in particular, giving him a name that was entirely his own. Rebecca gave birth to a girl, the only one among the 3. The child had Rebecca's sharp intelligence, visible even in infancy, her eyes tracking movement with uncanny focus. Rebecca named her Sarah, after her grandmother, a choice that made the older Sarah weep. Joshua met his children with a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, certainly, they were healthy and strong, but also terror, knowing the world they'd been born into, and guilt, because they existed only through an act of coercion, however necessary it had seemed at the time. Sarah's prediction about social ostracism proved accurate. The few neighbors who had remained cordial cut all ties. The ranch became an island, isolated and self-sufficient by necessity rather than choice. When Sarah tried to sell cattle in San Felipe, she was turned away. When Martha tried to buy supplies, shopkeepers refused her service. They survived, but barely. Joshua's skills kept them fed. He hunted game, expanded the vegetable garden, and bartered his labor to Mexican ranchers who cared less about social taboos than their Anglo counterparts. The 3 mothers devoted themselves to their children with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if by sheer force of love they could protect them from the world's judgment. The years passed slowly. The children grew strong and healthy, unaware at first of their unusual circumstances. They called Sarah grandmother and Joshua by his name, which was itself unusual. They played together, fought together, learned together. But understanding came eventually, as it always does. Little James was 6 when another child in San Felipe, they'd gone there for supplies despite the hostility, called him a mongrel and threw rocks at him. He came home bloodied and confused, and Martha had to explain what he was, what they all were. Thomas was 7 when he asked why he couldn't go to school with the white children. Elizabeth, tears streaming down her face, tried to explain the invisible boundaries that would shape his entire life. And Sarah, young Sarah, was 5 when she first understood that her grandmother's name had been both a gift and a burden, marking her as part of a family that had chosen to step outside acceptable bounds.
20 years after that fateful decision, Sarah Holloway stood on her porch once again, watching her grandchildren work the ranch. She was 62 now, her hair gone gray, her body bent with arthritis and hard work. But the ranch still stood. That was something. Joshua was 48, his body still strong but showing the wear of decades of labor. True to her word, Sarah had given him his freedom papers on his 43rd birthday, when the youngest child turned 10. But Joshua hadn't left. Where would he go? His children were here. His life was here. Freedom, it turned out, was more complicated than a piece of paper. The 3 daughters had never married, of course. What man would have them? But they'd built lives of a sort, lives dedicated to their children and the ranch. Martha had become the ranch foreman, running operations with an efficiency that would have made her father proud. Elizabeth had discovered a talent for training horses, building a small business that brought in much-needed income. And Rebecca had become a teacher, educating not just her own daughter, but the scattered children of Mexican families who didn't share Anglo prejudices. The children, adults now, had faced every hardship Sarah had feared and more. They'd been rejected, mocked, attacked. Young James bore scars from a fight in San Felipe that had nearly killed him. Thomas had been denied apprenticeships, land grants, basic respect. And Sarah girl had grown up faster than any child should, learning early that the world would judge her before knowing her. But they'd survived. More than that, they'd prevailed. The ranch was theirs now, legally transferred to them in documents that required a lawyer from Austin and a significant bribe to process. They'd expanded it, bought neighboring land when Walker died and his sons fled the territory. They'd built something real, something lasting. Sarah watched Joshua walk toward her, moving with the same measured grace he'd always possessed. He climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, looking out at the land they'd preserved through such terrible means. Was it worth it? Sarah asked quietly. It was a question she'd never dared voice before. Joshua considered for a long time before answering. Would we do it again, knowing what we know now? No, never. What we did was monstrous, no matter how necessary it seemed. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Then what did we accomplish? Life, Joshua said simply. 3 human beings who wouldn't exist otherwise. A ranch that provides for dozens of families now, Mexican and Anglo and mixed blood. A small crack in the wall of what's acceptable. He paused. It's not redemption, Sarah. What we did can't be redeemed. But maybe it can be transmuted into something less ugly, given time. They hate us, Sarah said. The children, for what we did to create them. Sometimes, Joshua agreed, but they also love us in their way. People are complicated. They can hold multiple truths at once. Sarah nodded slowly. She was tired, so very tired. When I die, and it won't be long now, I want to be buried on the hill next to James, and I want the truth carved on my stone.
Here lies Sarah Holloway, who chose survival over virtue. Let history judge. History will judge anyway, Joshua said, whether we want it to or not. They stood in silence, two old people bound together by a choice made in desperation, watching the sun set over land watered with blood and tears and the stubborn refusal to surrender to impossible circumstances. The children, their children, born of necessity and trauma and a bargain that had damned them all, worked on, building lives from the wreckage of their parents' decisions. In the end, Sarah thought, that was all anyone could do. Make impossible choices and live with the consequences. Build something from nothing and hope it lasted. Survive at any cost, and let future generations decide whether the price had been too high. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of blood and gold, the same colors that had witnessed the beginning of this strange, terrible, necessary thing they'd created. And on the hill, beneath the cottonwood tree, James Holloway's grave stood silent, knowing nothing of what his widow had done to preserve his legacy, or what that preservation had cost.